July 29th, 1981, 11:47 p.m., Royal Yacht Britannia. The wedding was over, the spectacle that 750 million people had watched. The glass coach, the 25-foot train, the kiss on the balcony was now just a memory. Diana sat alone in the stateroom of the royal yacht, still wearing her going-away outfit, staring at her reflection in the mirror and trying to understand what she was feeling. She should have been happy. She had just married a prince. She was now the Princess of Wales. The world had watched her fairy tale come true. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong all day, though she couldn't quite name it. The distance in Charles's eyes during the ceremony, the perfunctory nature of the balcony kiss, the way he'd seemed relieved when the public portion of the day ended and they could finally retreat to privacy. And now, on their wedding night, as she waited for her new husband to join her for what should have been the most romantic evening of her life, Diana felt something she would feel for the next 16 years, alone. But what Diana didn't know, what she was about to discover in the next hour, was that she wasn't just alone. She was married to a man who had brought another woman with him on their honeymoon, not physically, but symbolically, intimately, in a way that would make Diana understand, on her very first night as a married woman, that she would always be competing with a ghost, the ghost of Camilla Parker Bowles. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand what happened that night and why it destroyed Diana's faith in her marriage before the marriage had even truly begun, we have to go back to the warning signs Diana missed or ignored, back to the moments when Charles showed her, again and again, that his heart belonged to someone else, back to when the fairy tale was already a lie. February 6th, 1981, 5:47 p.m., Buckingham Palace. Diana stood in the sitting room of the palace, holding her left hand up to the light, watching the sapphire engagement ring sparkle. Charles had proposed 3 weeks ago. The ring was perfect, a stunning oval sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Diana loved it. What she didn't know was that Charles had let her choose it from a selection provided by the royal jewelers. He hadn't chosen it himself, hadn't put thought into what would suit her personality or taste, had simply let the jewelers present options and allowed Diana to pick the one she liked. Because Charles didn't know Diana well enough to choose a ring. They'd only been on 13 dates. They barely knew each other. But the palace had decided Diana Spencer was suitable. Young, virginal, from an appropriate family, malleable enough to be shaped into a proper princess. She would do. And Charles, under increasing pressure to marry and produce an heir, had proposed not out of love, but out of duty. "Are you happy?" Charles asked, standing by the window, looking out at the palace gardens rather than at his fiancée. "Yes," Diana said, though even then, 19 years old and desperate to believe in love, she felt a flutter of doubt. "Are you?" Charles turned to look at her. For a moment, something passed across his face. Sadness, resignation, something Diana couldn't quite identify. "Of course," he said. "This is what's expected. Expected, not wanted. Not desired, expected." Diana pushed the thought away. She was going to marry a prince. She was going to have the wedding every girl dreamed of. Everything would be perfect. It had to be. July 28th, 1981, 10:23 p.m., Clarence House. The night before the wedding, Diana couldn't sleep. She lay in bed at Clarence House, where she was staying with her sister Jane, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Charles. She'd barely seen him in the weeks leading up to the wedding. He'd been busy with official duties, he said, preparation for the marriage. But Diana had heard whispers from palace staff, rumors that Charles was spending time at someone's country house, that he'd been seen with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana knew who Camilla was, Charles's former girlfriend, the woman he'd loved before. Diana, Charles had assured her that relationship was over, that Camilla was married now happily to Andrew Parker Bowles, that she was just a friend. But Diana's intuition, that voice she was already learning not to trust, whispered that this wasn't true. Earlier that day, a package had arrived at Clarence House, a bracelet for Charles from Camilla. Diana had seen it before a palisade whisked it away. The bracelet was engraved with two initials, G and F. "What does that mean?" Diana had asked. "Oh, just silly nicknames, Mom. Nothing to worry about." But Diana worried, because why would another woman, a woman, Charles insisted was just a friend, send him jewelry the night before his wedding? And why would that jewelry have intimate nicknames engraved on it? Diana almost called off the wedding that night, almost told her sister she couldn't go through with it. But she was 19 years old, and 750 million people were going to watch her marry a prince tomorrow. And the wedding gifts had been delivered, and the cake had been made, and the dress was hanging in the wardrobe. How could she back out now? So she didn't. She pushed down her doubts and told herself everything would be fine. Once they were married, once they were alone together, once the public spectacle was over and they could finally be a real couple. She was wrong. July 29th, 1981, 2:47 p.m., St. Paul's Cathedral. The ceremony was magnificent. Diana walked down the aisle in her ivory silk taffeta dress, the 25-foot train flowing behind her, looking like every fairy tale princess who had ever existed. Charles waited at the altar in his naval uniform, watching her approach with an expression that Diana couldn't quite read. Not love, not joy, something more like relief that they were getting through this. During the vows, Diana famously got the order of Charles's names wrong, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. The congregation chuckled. Diana blushed. Charles looked irritated. And when Charles said his vows, he included a word that would later become infamous. When asked if he would love, honor, and keep Diana, he responded, "All this I will do." But Diana's vows asked the same question, and she was supposed to respond, "I will." Charles had changed his vows, added, "All this I will do," instead of the simple direct "I will." Such a small change, but it reflected something, a distance, a formality, a sense that this was a contract being fulfilled rather than a love being celebrated. The kiss on the balcony was brief, perfunctory. Charles had to be prompted by the crowds chanting to kiss Diana at all. And when he did, it was a quick peck, nothing more. Diana smiled for the cameras. But something inside her was already breaking. July 29th, 1981, 11:47 p.m., Royal Yacht Britannia. We return to this moment. Diana alone in the stateroom, waiting for Charles, trying to convince herself that once they were alone, once the public performance was over, everything would be different. Charles entered the stateroom, already changed into more casual clothes. He looked tired, relieved that the day was over, but not, Diana noticed, particularly eager to be alone with his new wife. "That went well, I think," Charles said, pouring himself a drink. The crowds were enthusiastic. Diana stood up, nervous, young, wanting to feel close to her husband on their wedding night. "Charles, before I forget," Charles interrupted, reaching into his pocket. "I need to put these in the safe. Don't want to lose them." He pulled out a pair of cufflinks, gold, distinctive, and engraved with two letters, F and G. Diana stared at them. "What are those?" "Cufflinks. For formal occasions. I can see they're cufflinks." "What do the letters mean?" Charles hesitated, just for a moment. But in that hesitation, Diana saw everything. "They're just initials, a gift from a friend." "What friend?" "Does it matter?" "Yes, Charles, it matters. We just got married. You're wearing cufflinks with another woman's initials. So yes, it matters very much." Charles sighed, the sigh of a man who didn't want to have this conversation, but realized he had no choice. "They're from Camilla. The initials stand for Gladys and Fred, silly nicknames we had for each other years ago." Diana felt the room tilt. "You wore cufflinks from Camilla on our wedding day." "On our wedding night?" "They're just cufflinks, Diana. They're not just cufflinks. They're—" She stopped, trying to control her voice, trying not to cry. "Charles, we just got married. And you wore another woman's jewelry. Jewelry with nicknames that exclude me. That remind you of her every time you look at your wrists. You're being overly sensitive." "Am I? Or am I finally seeing the truth? You're still in love with her, aren't you? You've been in love with her this whole time." Charles set down his drink. "Diana, I married you. We had the wedding. We made the vows. What more do you want? I want you to love me. I want you to want to be with me. I want to be more than just the suitable bride the palace chose for you. Lower your voice. The staff will hear. I don't care if the staff hears. I care that my husband wore another woman's jewelry on our wedding day. Charles's expression went cold. Diana, I'm going to say this once. My relationship with Camilla is complicated, yes. We have history, but that's all it is, history. I have done my duty. I have married you. I will be a faithful husband, but I will not be interrogated about friendships that existed before you and will continue after you. Diana felt tears streaming down her face. After me? We just got married, and you're already talking about after me? That's not what I meant. Yes, it was. You don't love me. You never did. I was just the acceptable option, young enough to control, naive enough to believe in fairy tales. Diana! Get out, just get out. I can't look at you right now. Charles picked up his cufflinks, placed them carefully in his jacket pocket, and left the stateroom without another word. Diana collapsed onto the bed and cried. Her wedding night, the night that was supposed to be romantic and magical, and the beginning of a beautiful life together. Instead, it was the night she learned the truth. Her husband loved someone else, had always loved someone else, would always love someone else, and she was trapped. July 30th, 1981, 7:23 a.m., Royal Yacht Britannia. The next morning, Diana woke up with swollen eyes and a broken heart. Charles had never returned to the stateroom. He'd spent the night elsewhere on the yacht, ostensibly to give Diana space, but really because he couldn't face the confrontation. When they met for breakfast, surrounded by staff and the beginning of their Mediterranean honeymoon cruise, they played their parts, smiled for the photographers who captured them on deck, waved to the crowds that lined the harbors they visited. But in private, Diana was cold, Charles was distant, and the marriage that had lasted less than 12 hours was already irreparably damaged. Diana noticed other things during that honeymoon. The way Charles made phone calls at odd hours, speaking in low tones. The photos of Camilla she found tucked into Charles's diary, not hidden, just there, as if Charles saw nothing wrong with carrying photographs of another woman on his honeymoon with his wife. The way Charles would sometimes call Diana Camilla by mistake, then pretend it hadn't happened. The way he read books or painted rather than spend time with Diana, as if her company was an obligation rather than a pleasure. And Diana began to understand. She was the third person in this marriage. She always had been. The wedding, the vows, the public spectacle, none of it had changed the fundamental reality that Charles's heart belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles. August 1981, Balmoral Castle. After the honeymoon, they went to Balmoral for the traditional summer holiday with the royal family. Diana was miserable. The castle was cold. The family was formal and distant. And Charles spent most of his time fishing or painting, leaving Diana alone for hours. One evening, Diana confronted him again about Camilla. You're still in contact with her, aren't you? Charles looked up from his book. Yes, she's a friend. She's more than a friend. You call her every day. I call several friends every day. Do you wear their jewelry too? Charles closed his book with a snap. Diana, we've been through this. I will not end my friendships because you're insecure. I'm not insecure. I'm married to a man who's in love with someone else. If you truly believe that, then perhaps you should reconsider this marriage. Diana stared at him. We've been married for 5 weeks. Yes, and you've spent those 5 weeks making accusations and causing drama. Perhaps if you matured a bit, we could have a pleasant relationship. A pleasant relationship? Charles, I don't want a pleasant relationship. I want a real marriage. I want a husband who loves me. Then you married the wrong person, Charles said quietly. Because I told you from the beginning, this is a royal marriage, not a love match. You knew that when you said yes. Diana felt something shatter inside her. Because Charles was right in a way. She had known. She'd seen the signs, the emotional distance, the warnings from her sister Jane. The way Charles had seemed more relieved than excited about the engagement. But she'd been 19 years old and desperate to believe in fairy tales. And now, at barely 20, she was trapped in a marriage with a man who would never love her, all because of a bracelet and cufflinks, and a woman named Camilla who had never let go of the man Diana had married. September 1981, Kensington Palace. Diana was pregnant, barely 8 weeks into the marriage, and she was carrying the heir to the throne. This should have brought them closer, should have given them something to bond over. Instead, Charles seemed almost resentful, as if Diana's pregnancy was another obligation imposed on him, another duty fulfilled. And Diana, suffering from terrible morning sickness and profound loneliness, began to realize the full horror of her situation. She was married to a man who didn't want her. She was carrying his child, and she would spend the rest of her life trapped in a role that required her to smile and wave while her heart broke in private. The cufflinks became symbolic for Diana. Every time she saw Charles wear them, and he wore them often, defiantly, she was reminded of that first night. The night she learned her marriage was a lie. The night her fairy tale died. She would later tell friends, "I knew on my wedding night that I'd made a terrible mistake. But by then it was too late." 1992, the separation. It would take Diana 11 years to leave the marriage. 11 years of infidelity. Charles openly resuming his relationship with Camilla by 1986. 11 years of Diana fighting back through her own affairs, her public appearances, her determination to be a different kind of princess than the palace wanted. But she never forgot the wedding night, never forgot the cufflinks, never forgot the moment she realized she was married to a man whose heart belonged to someone else. In her famous Martin Bashir interview in 1995, Diana would say, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." But really, the marriage had been crowded from the very beginning. From the moment Charles put on those cufflinks with Gladys and Fred engraved on them. From the moment he chose to bring Camilla with him symbolically on his wedding night. Diana was never first, never primary, never the woman Charles wanted. She was just the woman the palace needed him to marry. The broodmare, as she would later call herself. The acceptable bride who could produce heirs and then be quietly sidelined once her biological purpose was fulfilled. And she knew it on her wedding night. July 29th, 1997, 16 years later. 16 years after that devastating wedding night, Diana was finally free, divorced, independent, building a life on her own terms. She would die exactly 33 days later. But in those final weeks, Diana told friends she had no regrets about leaving Charles. The only regret she had was not leaving sooner, not trusting her instincts that first night when she saw the cufflinks and understood the truth. "I wasted years trying to make him love me," she said. But you can't make someone love you, especially when their heart has always belonged to someone else. The cufflinks are still in the royal collection. Charles kept them, wore them after Diana died, wore them at his wedding to Camilla in 2005, a final insult. Or perhaps just the truth Diana had always known. Camilla had won, had always been the one Charles wanted, had always been there in the background waiting, and Diana had simply been an interruption, a necessary interruption to produce William and Harry, but an interruption nonetheless. The wedding night revealed everything. The rest was just details. Today, William and Harry know about the cufflinks. They know what their father did on his wedding night. They know how their mother cried alone while Charles wore another woman's jewelry and felt no shame. Some say it's one of the reasons William was so careful about choosing Catherine. Why he dated her for so long before proposing. Why he made sure, absolutely sure, that he loved her and only her before he brought her into the royal family. Because William remembered his mother's pain, remembered how she'd been used and discarded, remembered that she knew on her wedding night, on the night that should have been the happiest of her life, that her marriage was doomed, and he was determined never to do that to someone he claimed to love. The cufflinks are small objects, insignificant in themselves, but they represented everything that was wrong with Charles and Diana's marriage. The lies, the betrayal, the presence of another woman who was always there, always more important, always the real love of Charles's life. Diana spent 20 years being second choice, second priority, second place, and it all started on her wedding night. with a pair of gold cufflinks engraved with letters that excluded her. G and F, Gladys and Fred, Charles and Camilla, the people who really belonged together, while Diana was just the woman who got in the way. So here we stand at the end of this story, understanding that Diana's marriage was doomed from the very beginning, that the fairy tale 750 million people watched was built on lies and duty and a man who never stopped loving someone else, that the most romantic night of Diana's life became her first lesson in heartbreak. What do you think Charles should have done? Should he have refused to marry Diana if he knew he didn't love her? Or was he trapped by duty just as much as she was? And how do you think Diana found the strength to stay in that marriage for 11 more years after such a devastating beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is where we honor Diana's pain, where we recognize the courage it took to eventually leave, where we remember that behind the fairy tale was a young woman who deserved so much better. If this story broke your heart the way it broke Diana's, please subscribe. There are more untold moments, more private betrayals, more truths about what Diana endured that the palace never wanted revealed. Together, we'll make sure her whole story is told. Together, we'll remember that she was more than a princess. She was a woman who suffered, who fought back, and who deserved a love she never received.